Hello and welcome to week 13 of FINA H111, History of Art 1, Prehistory to Medieval. My name is Dr. Aaron Schwartz, and this is a course being put on by Indiana University, Purdue University of Fort Wayne. Our topic for week 13 is Gothic art and architecture in Europe. So with that, let's move on to our first slide. So let's begin by taking a look at this map of Europe. Last week we discussed Romanesque cathedrals and the development of pilgrimage routes across Europe that will be influencing the construction of these major cathedrals. Now we're moving on to the Gothic era, and Europe by the year 1200 looks something like this, where we see the Kingdom of France, the Holy Roman Empire, England, several Spanish kingdoms. We see all of these larger political entities have evolved out of early medieval Europe. For the sake of this lecture, we're going to be concentrating on France and the development of Gothic architectural style. Your book will go into a lot more detail about what's happening in the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, over in Spain. But just to keep things concise in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing in the development of this style in France. It's going to be in the 13th and 14th century that we'll see Chartres Cathedral, which we'll look at in a little bit here, and similar French buildings that will begin to set the standard throughout Europe for architecture. For the clergy and lay public, the same, the great cathedrals towering over their towns were not considered distortions of a classical style, but modern work. So we're looking at what was in the 13th and 14th centuries considered the most modern kind of architecture. We will see within these spheres glorious images of the city of God, heavenly Jerusalem, and there'll be very much the idea in these cities that build these cathedrals that this is a privilege to have one of these cathedrals, to be able to participate in the construction of these cathedrals. We're not just thinking about bringing in pilgrims, about the monetary impact of having one of these cathedrals. There's definitely an obvious religious and spiritual element to it as well. So the Gothic cathedral was a very unique product of an era of peace and widespread economic prosperity, very deep spirituality, and extraordinary technological innovation. The essential ingredient of these towering holy structures were these lofty masonry-ribbed vaults on pointed arches, held in place by buttresses and flying buttresses, and interiors illuminated with stained glass windows, and we'll take a look at all of these features here. So the reason that we're having all of this wonderful building and these magnificent buildings are able to be put up is because Europe is surprisingly peaceful at this time. Things have died down after the Crusades. Things are pretty much settled because everything's at peace. The economy is picking up. We're going to see the solidification of these major kingdoms, like the one in France. And all of these pieces come together to create the Gothic era. So the key monument of this style, which we will get to in a little bit, is Chartres Cathedral. It was begun about 1145, and the church dedicated to Notre Dame, Our Lady. This apparently houses her mantle, which is considered a precious relic. So we'll still see the use of relics and reliquaries to give these buildings added significance. So we'll talk a bit more about Chartres a little bit later on in the presentation, but let's begin at the beginning with one of our first early examples of Gothic architecture. So in France, we have a small abbey church of Saint-Denis. In the year 1122, a monk named Suger became abbot of Saint-Denis. The church that he became abbot of, this monastery church, was in a great deal of disrepair. It needed to be renovated quite badly. He needed to expand the basilica to accommodate all of the pilgrims that were coming in, and just really needed to refurbish the entire building. He thought that the basilica was of insufficient grandeur also, and that if he could make the interior space a bit nicer, a bit more grand, this would encourage official visits and obviously be of benefit to the church as well. We know a fair amount about Suger and his where he came from, and your book goes into some of those details. I'll let you read that there. But what's important for us is that Suger is writing a lot, many treatises on architecture, holy architecture, and the importance of creating these kinds of spaces. So we can kind of point our finger towards Saint-Denis and Abbé Suger as one of the originators, or let's say one of the foundational voices in the development of Gothic style and Gothic architecture. So he writes about his church's need to expand, and he writes quite extensively about the need to bring light into the space. So if we look at this image here, we're looking at the ambulatory and radiating chapels of this church, and I'll draw your attention up to the ceiling. We're going to notice a couple of things right away. We're going to notice slightly pointed arches, and we're going to notice these ribbed arches in the vaults, in these crossing vaults. So this is a part of Abbé Suger's remodeling of Saint-Denis, and really the beginning of Gothic architecture. So we see ribbed vaults with pointed arches that spring from very slender columns. And then we just, in this image, see a glimpse of some stained glass windows as well. So this sort of circular approach with an ambulatory that wraps around the main apse with those sorts of architectural features are going to become some of the foundational characteristics of Gothic. And we'll see a slightly different view on this in the next slide. Here's just a slightly different point of view with some different lighting. Again, to give us a sense of the depth and movement through the space. And as I mentioned, all of these features that we see here are going to become foundational to Gothic cathedrals later on. What we'll see is in the evolution of the Gothic style. Imagine this, but bigger, 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 and bigger. We will really see this interest in creating the spaces as large and complex as possible. So here's a quick look at our floor plan for Saint-Denis, where we can see the complexity of the support structure for the roof. And what we'll notice is his use of using very light ribbed vaultings. The builders are able to eliminate walls between the radiating chapels. And I'll try to put some arrows on here to indicate what I'm talking about. So what this is doing is it's freeing up this interior space. We no longer have to have our radiating chapels closed off with walls to support the roof. The ribbed vaulting is a type of attached buttress to the roof that's going to help support these massively heavy roofs and keep them over the heads of the worshippers. Once Suger sort of figures this out and begins to implement this in Saint-Denis, it really opens the door for architects of this era to expand upon the idea and to push it further and further. Just one more look at Saint-Denis, looking straight up at the vaults of the ambulatory and radiating chapels of the choir, to give you, again, just a sense of what this architecture looks like. And I do want to point out that in Saint-Denis here, and in many of these Gothic cathedrals we'll be looking at, that is all masonry and brickwork. We're not using concrete like we might have seen in ancient Rome. We have to use a different type of material here. That material just functions differently, it's put together differently, it's weighted differently. And that's going to be a part of the reason why we need all of these ribs and supports and extra columns, is to just hold up the massive weight of all of that brick and all of that mortar. We'll see that besides the actual ribbing itself, you notice we're not putting any extra art on the ceiling. The ceiling is not painted, it's not covered sculpture. We're simply using the architectural features itself to create that visual effect. When many people think of Gothic cathedrals, one of the first ones that comes to mind is Chartres. And it is probably one of our pinnacle examples of the style. So I like this aerial shot. It gives you a sense of the massive scale of these churches. You can see the houses and the cars on the street, just how immense these churches are. Also, the shot affords us a nice look at the overall architectural structure. We can see that it is a cruciform plan with an emphasized transept to give us a Latin cross look. We have a pretty immense portal on the front narthex, where we can see these two mismatched but still very impressive towers. Chartres has a long history. It was begun in 1134. It had to be rebuilt after 1194. As we look at the side, the face of the building facing us here on the side, we'll notice some pretty important innovations, including lots and lots of flying buttresses. So a flying buttress is a type of support unit. It's sort of a you can almost think of it as a column that comes up from the ground but then curves in towards the building. So it's not like a post and lintel sort of idea. It makes Gothic cathedrals very much what we call exoskeletal, where we can clearly see all of the support structures, all of the things trying to hold those walls up in these massive buildings. Here we are down at street level looking at the royal portal of the west facade of Chartres Cathedral. The sculptors are doing some very interesting things with the images across these three doorways. To unite the three doorways iconographically and visually, the sculptors carved episodes from the lives of the Virgin, Notre Dame, and Christ on the capitals, which form a kind of frieze linking one entrance to the next. Christ's ascension into heaven appears in the tympanum of the left portal. All around in the archivolts are the signs of the zodiac and scenes representing various labors of the months of the year. They are symbols of the cosmic and earthly worlds. The second coming is the subject of the central tympanum. The signs of the 4 evangelists, the 24 elders of the apocalypse, and the 12 apostles appear around Christ or on the lintel. In the tympanum of the right portal, Christ appears in the lap of the Virgin Mary. Scenes of the Savior's childhood fill the lintel below, where Jesus appears on an altar, connecting the sculptures at the entrance to the church with this idea of the symbolic sacrifice and Eucharist. So it's very interesting in terms of how big these doors are, what a massive sort of presence they have, that we are taking great deal of care to choose these scenes carefully so that it tells a continuous story across all 3 entrances. In terms of the style, what we can see here, the figures are still a little rigid and abstract. We'll see that change a little bit throughout the Gothic era, and we'll see just a touch of naturalism start to come in a little bit later on. But right now, these figures are almost Byzantine in their appearance, in their flatness, and in their stiff shapes. Here we're looking at the door jamb near the central doorway of that same portal. So this is what flanks either doorway. These are Old Testament kings and queens. These are considered in the church as the royal ancestors of Christ, and so we see them represented in this place of honor. Early Gothic jamb figures will display the first signs of a new naturalism. Now, we need to use that term a little carefully, because as we look at these figures, you'll see that they're still quite stiff. They're still very rigid, but as we look at the details, first of all, the detail is quite beautiful. The intricacy of the carving of the robes, really nice work going on here. We'll notice that although we get some sense of anatomy underneath the robes, just barely, we get some nice facial expressions in here. We will eventually see this evolve into a much more natural-looking style. A little bit of classicism will start to creep its way back into this architecture. At Chartres here, we see some interest in that. However, the figures still maintain a certain level of rigidity and abstraction. Now we're moving on to Laon Cathedral. Now both Chartres and the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis had very long construction histories, and really only small portion of those structures date to the early Gothic period. Laon, that we're looking at here, however, begun about 1160 and finished shortly after 1200. So this is going to provide us with a more comprehensive picture of French church architecture in the second half of the 12th century. So as we look at the front of this building, Laon builders retained many Romanesque features in their design. They'll combine them with rib vaulting resting on pointed arches and some of those more essential elements of early Gothic architecture. So as we look at this, again, it's so difficult to try to communicate this in a slideshow like this. These cathedrals are incredibly large, just massively large. As we look at this structure, we'll notice these really wonderful towers on either side. We'll notice how the facade here is divided into sections of threes, multiples of threes. And if you think back to the Romanesque, what we talked about last week, you'll notice that the basic structure, the basic layout of what we're looking at with Laon is very similar to what we saw in the Romanesque. Obviously, the big difference is going to be the scale, how large it is, but also the level of decoration and intricacy is obviously stepped up to a much greater degree here at Laon. So what we'll see on the facade of Laon that's typically Gothic are very large central rose window, and you see that above the central portal there. We'll see these deep porches in the front doorways. Those doors are set way back in the porches. And we'll see this sort of increased interest in breaking up the surface of the building to create more dramatic effects of light and shadow. And again, this is something that's very difficult to show in a slideshow. But you just have to sort of imagine what this building looks like at different times of the day. From the morning sun hitting the front of this facade, the evening sun, there would be times when that front portal would catch a lot of the light inside of there. Other parts of the day would be completely in shadow. It's going to create a lot of really fantastic effects and shadow effects that's really going to make this space feel much larger and more dynamic than you might expect from a large stone building. Here we are inside of Laon Cathedral. We're way up here in the triforium and looking down at the nave, again to try to give us a sense of the sheer size of these. We'll see the insertion of a triforium in Laon will break up the nave wall and produce the characteristics of a four-story early Gothic interior elevation. So we see nave arcade, vaulted gallery, triforium, and clerestory. And your book will detail what exactly all of these are. I'm not going to go through and try to use arrows and point them all out here. That's what your book is for. But I will point your attention to also the sheer amount of light that we're getting in this building. You notice all of these windows on the side walls behind these supports shining natural light into that space. This is the major reason, the main reason really, why we need all of those flying buttresses on the outside of these buildings. As you build these buildings larger and taller, we want to add more and more windows in them so that we can illuminate these interior spaces. Well, you don't have to be an architect to understand that glass does not bear weight as well as stone does. So if we're removing all of that stone out of the wall and replacing it with glass, these walls simply are not as sturdy. They can't maintain that weight and the weight of these massive roofs on top of it. That's where the flying buttresses come in. The flying buttresses on the exterior of the building will help dissipate some of that weight to just keep the walls up. It's a really fantastic idea. It may seem obvious to us today, of course. Well, of course, you put a support on the outside. But it's a tremendous innovation, and we see them using it on such a massive scale. So I spoke a little bit about the development of Laon's triforium and that 4-story elevation. Gothic naves evolve from a 4-story elevation, arcade, tribune, gallery, triforium, clerestory, to a 3-story elevation without the tribune. The height of the vaults will also increase very dramatically. So this is a nice little cross-section of the nave elevations to try to put these buildings into perspective. So we just looked at Laon, which is A here. We looked at Chartres already, which is C on this one. We're going to look at Paris in a little bit, and we'll look at Amiens a little bit later. So what we'll see is this shift away from a 4-story appearance to a 3-story appearance. And when we go from that 3-story look, we'll be greatly expanding the height of the nave. All of this is to try to create a space that looks even bigger than it is. It's not enough that these buildings are massively large. We need them to look even bigger. And so we'll start using techniques to sort of fool the eye, optical illusions, if you will, to increase the apparent verticality of these already massively vertical buildings. All of that is a part of the drama of the space, the idea that these are palaces for the Holy Spirit, and it becomes very important to the church builders and to the people who use these buildings as places of worship that we have this extraordinary sense of space, this idea that you can't possibly experience the light and the sound and the overwhelming characteristics of these buildings anywhere else, that they are unique to these houses of worship. So while most scholars might cite Chartres as a premier example of the style of early Gothic architecture, when you ask sort of common people, sort of popular opinion, name a Gothic cathedral, probably most people are going to think of this one, Notre Dame in Paris. This has a very long and complicated building history. It was about the year 1130 that Louis VI moved his official residence to Paris, which this brings a huge economic boom to the city. They start paving the roads, they start rebuilding a lot of the buildings there, and obviously they need to replace the old cathedral with a new cathedral, befitting Paris's status as the city of the king. So they replace an old basilica with what we're seeing here. It's a very complicated building history. The choir and the transept were completed by 1182, the nave by about 1225, and the facade not until 1250 to 1260. The original elevation had 4 stories, but the scheme was very different from Laon's. In each bay, in place of a triforium over a gallery, was a stained glass oculus. It's a tremendously complicated building structure. In this shot, as you look at it, you can see how important the flying buttresses are. These side aisles here that we're looking at of Notre Dame in Paris is just completely filled with glass. We have very, very thin masonry combined with all of this glass, which means that these flying buttresses become extremely important. And though flying buttresses are, of course, used on other Gothic cathedrals, they're much more prominent here on Notre Dame, Paris, because those walls are so thin, so tall, and so full of glass. They become essential to keeping this building upright. Let's take a look at a different view of this building. Here we see another view of some of those flying buttresses in one of the side entrances with a huge rose window, a tower sticking up at the intersection of the transept and the nave. We can see a little bit of the front facade here with some engaged buttressing and these really large, impressive bell towers on either side of the portals. And here's just a quick look at a detail of some of those flying buttresses. Notre Dame in Paris is one of the first really large-scale grand cathedrals to use flying buttresses to this degree. Now we're moving back to Chartres, and the reason that we're backtracking back to Chartres is because churches often caught on fire in the Middle Ages, and church officials often had to raise money unexpectedly for new building campaigns. In contrast to monastic churches, which usually were small and could be completed quickly, the construction histories of these urban cathedrals usually extended over decades, sometimes even centuries. So what we're looking at here is the interior of Chartres Cathedral, facing towards the east. This is a later phase of construction after we have a fire in Chartres. So we're looking at this as more of a mid to late Gothic construction as opposed to an early Gothic construction. That's the only reason we're looking at it here. As we look at the inside, we'll see all of these characteristics that are quintessentially Gothic. We see this narrow nave that is extremely tall, these large springing vaults. We noticed the elevation inside, the extensive use of stained glass at the top. We have ribbed vaulting, pointed arches, all of those characteristics that we want to use when we describe Gothic cathedrals. So the renovated Chartres that we're looking at here will establish the high Gothic model in its tripartite elevation consisting of a nave arcade, triforium, and clerestory with those stained glass windows almost as tall as the main arcade. Those stained glass windows are immensely tall. Here we're looking at just one of the stained glass windows in Chartres. Quite miraculously, this survived the devastating fire of 1194. So it's quite amazing that it survived that trauma intact. So as we look at this, we'll notice that it is the Virgin and Child and angels. This is a window in the choir of Chartres Cathedral. It's approximately 16 feet tall, really an immense piece. Now your book will go into more detail about stained glass windows, how they're made, and some of the symbolism in them, so I won't retread that here. But we'll notice that we have a lot of use of primary colors, reds and blues. That's going to be very significant in terms of its symbolism, and the fact that it's going to make this glass even more precious a material because those are primary colors. We'll notice Mary enthroned with the halo holding Christ child on her lap. We'll notice the dove of the Holy Spirit above her head. And on our next slide, we'll see a little bit more close-up on how this is put together. Here we just see a slightly different section, a little bit closer to the subject matter. You'll notice all of these dark lines. The dark lines within the composition is the leading that's holding these smaller panes of glass together. You could almost think about this as a mosaic of glass. But what these stained glass windows do, they have a couple of different functions. Obviously, they're just extraordinary to look at. They're really vibrant pieces. When you get the sun shining directly through them and you're inside the cathedral, they're really spectacular. They just glow with this light, and it's beautiful to behold. Now, we will get a little bit of that colored light then streaming into the nave. But for the most part, and you can kind of see it in this image, as you look at those blue panes of glass, for example, they are very dark, and while they're not completely opaque, they don't allow a lot of light to shine into the nave. So while these are spectacular pieces, and they will bring some light into the interior space, it actually does make some of those interior spaces a lot darker. So we're still struggling with that problem of how to illuminate these interior spaces. They're so large, they're so tall. That tends to be very often why these are put way, way up high near the roof and the clerestory of the buildings. If you're down in the nave looking up at them, you can see them illuminated. They're quite spectacular. They're gorgeous. But we can use the lower levels to put clear glass window and actually bring that sunlight into the nave itself. One of the crowning features of Chartres Cathedral, though, is the rose window and lancets from the north transept. A fantastic piece. As we look at that rose window, it's approximately 43 feet in diameter. Just insane. So we see this held in place by a very intricate armature of bar tracery. It fills almost the entire facade wall of the high Gothic north transept of Chartres. There's all kinds of iconography going on in here. We can see doves, we can see figures, we can see Christ, we can see, there's just so much going on here. Heraldic images as well. Absolutely packing the space. Again, when the light shines through this window, it just absolutely glows in just such a vibrant, incredible way. And I do want to point out, it may be difficult for us in the 21st century to sort of think back of what it would have been like to live in the 13th century and be seeing these windows. But I do encourage you to stop for a moment and just think about what it would have been like. We today, in the 21st century, we have little glowing boxes that entertain us all day long. TV sets, computers, smartphones. We're surrounded by these little, fantastic glowing boxes and talking boxes that entertain us whenever we happen to want it, or educate us like you guys are experiencing right now. Try, though, to think about living in a time before anything like that, before you even had a concept of this kind of technology. And you're going to a church, you're going there to worship and to express your faith, and you're seeing these images, and of course you're smart enough to know that it's glass and that it's colored and sunlight is shining through it. It's not like you're mystified on where these images are coming from. But these things must have been just so breathtaking and spectacular. A common person in France, you don't have anything like this in your house. There's no way for you to experience this sort of drama and intensity of color and this glowing, luminous object. It had to be absolutely breathtaking. Combine that with that cathedral space where we're going to have incense burning, the smoke of incense and candles in the air, choirs singing, that wonderful, church choir music that's reverberating across this massive nave. It would have been truly a transcendent, very spiritual, very earnest experience. And that's something that it's very easy to lose sight of. As we're reading our book, as we're looking at these little slides on your computer screen, it's easy to lose sight of how medieval people experienced these objects. And it's important to remind ourselves once in a while that this would have been an experience, a performance. It would have been something that they would have had a very real emotional attachment to. So anyway, I just wanted to take a moment to try to put us in the scene a little bit. These things are extraordinary in their own right, even still today. But I just want to mention what this must have meant and how medieval people must have reacted to them in situ in the 13th century. As we move to the outside of Chartres, these are some more jam statues from the exterior portal, and we're going to start to see how the figure evolves from those very rigid, narrow, elongated figures that we saw earlier to these guys. They're still kind of rigid. We notice that there's not a lot of indication of a body or contrapposto or anything in their pose. They have these little niches that they're standing on. But we will see, you'll notice their heads are all turned a different way. The person on the left here, I believe that's St. Martin, he seems to be speaking. He's got his mouth open. We're seeing a little bit of personality. We're seeing some movement in the figures as a more classical element of naturalism is beginning to come back, is beginning to creep back into these sculptures. So now we're going to move away from Chartres to Amiens Cathedral, which was begun in about 1220. A very distinctive looking facade. The very deep, piercing facade of Amiens actually leaves very few surfaces for decoration, but sculptors will cover the remaining surfaces with these colonnettes, pinnacles, rosettes that nearly... It almost looks like the facade has dissolved underneath all of these details. With all of those windows, all of these little pointy things all over it. How the words I like to use when I describe Amiens, and these may not be very scholarly, but I think they're accurate. It has a certain lacy sort of feel to it, and as large as this building is, and you can see some cars on the street to give us a sense of scale here. It doesn't necessarily feel like a very heavy, oppressive building, just because there's all of this very intricate light detail on it. The arches over the portals are pointed, but you'll notice that the arch over it has a point, and there are little pointy things on top of there. I like to make the joke that in the Gothic architecture is very pointy. We put points on our points and points on our points on our points. Anytime we can just sort of add that extra layer of detail, that extra layer of verticality, we're going to do it by the time we get to the High Gothic. And Amiens here is a fantastic example. Again, we see a massive rose window. We have very, very deep porches here. We have these bell towers that, again, a little mismatch because of the different construction phases of the building. So here we are in the interior of Amiens Cathedral, where we see that skeletal ribbed structure of Gothic cathedrals really reaches its apex here at Amiens. We see four-part walls, pointed arches, from floor to ceiling. That point at the top there reaches 144 feet. Immense. And you can see how narrow it is compared to how tall it is. All of that emphasizing that verticality. And this is a nice shot because you can really see how the sunlight comes into the building and how we're trying to manipulate that light to move it completely around the space. Here we're looking up at the choir vaults of Amiens. The choir vaults resemble a type of canopy on bundled masts. The light entering in from the clerestory and triforium creates this very buoyant sensation, a lightness, which is not usually associated with stone structures. So you're seeing all of those windows are letting in all of this light, and even the structure of the bays where the ribbing intersects, it sort of catches that light, it casts some shadows. All of it is giving it this illusion of verticality and lightness and daintiness, which, if you think about it, is extremely hard to do, considering how many tons and tons and tons of masonry are pressing down on these walls. But they still manage to create a space that feels very open and very light. Here we are outside of Amiens Cathedral, looking at the Trumeau. And we have a figure here called the Beau Dieu, Trumeau statue here from about 1220 to 1235. Beau Dieu, and I apologize, my French is not that great. I may not be quite pronouncing that right. He blesses all who enters Amiens Cathedral. This means beautiful God. You'll see at his feet, there's a fantastic little scene at his feet where he's trampling both a lion and a dragon. And those are symbols of evil forces in the world. So we have a sort of conflation of Jesus Christ and God the Father in one figure, trampling evil, blessing all of those who walk through the doors on either side of him. It gives a fairly benevolent notion of Christ. While there may be an element here of Christ in judgment, this is a benevolent Christ, blessing those who are coming into his church. And here's just a slightly different angle. You can see the dragon and the lion a little bit better. And you see that Christ, although giving a blessing, is a little impassive. He's got this nice canopy over him. But we'll notice again just a little bit more realism in terms of his pose and how he's standing, although he's very much attached to that pillar behind him. We definitely have this interest in showing a three-dimensional figure that people can relate to as they walk into the church. Now we're moving on to Reims Cathedral. So Reims is really quite remarkable in what it's doing with its facade. It reveals a high Gothic architect's desire to replace heavy masonry with intricately framed void space. We'll see stained glass windows in the tympanum instead of the stonework that we usually see. And I do want to point out in the lower right-hand corner of the building, you see a couple of people standing there. I always like to use photographs that have people in them when I can, just to give us a sense of scale and how incredibly large these buildings are. Like Amiens, Reims, very pointy, very vertical, points on points. We're seeing this sort of, it's almost too much. There's just so much going on here. But we see all of this piercing of the facade where we can see through the lancets. We have this massive rose window in the center. We have smaller but still incredibly large rose windows in the tympana. Everything that can have some kind of detail, some kind of tracing, a sculpture, something on it, has it on it. We're really seeing here, this is high Gothic ornamentation. Again, to use a not very scholarly term, it almost looks like a gingerbread house. It has that certain gingerbready, almost overdone, overwrought appearance to it. This is sort of the ultimate expression of what we're going for in the Gothic era. And so here are some more jam statues from Reims Cathedral. And here we see a visitation scene. And what's important about this is that we're actually starting to see some contrapposto with these figures. They're turned towards each other in a more conversational kind of style. They all resemble freestanding statues. They have their arms and bodies are in motion. They actually seem to be conversing with each other. We can get a sense of how the body anatomy works underneath those robes. We can see the sway of the hips, the tilt of the shoulders. We can see, knees as they're bent underneath the robes. We're just seeing those elements of realism and classicism starting to creep back into European sculpture. And these are some fantastic examples of that here. Now we'll take a moment to look at much more small-scale objects. We'll take a look at a few illuminated manuscript pages here. This is a dedication page to the royal book, of a royal book. It depicts Saint Louis, his mother, and French regent Blanche of Castile. It depicts a monk and a lay scribe that worked on the painted illustrations of the Bible. Your book will talk a little bit more in detail about the history of this piece, so I'm going to talk more about the style. We'll notice that we have royal figures up at the top. We have our clergyman and our scribe at the bottom. We're going to notice that the background on these figures, there's really nothing in the way of background or perspective. We're using that really flat golden space, not dissimilar to what we saw in the Byzantine era. That use of gold obviously is a prestige object because it's enormously expensive, but it also creates an environment of something ethereal and religious and spiritual. We also see an interest in showing the royalty and their command over the clergy and the monks who are responsible for the handiwork and the creation object. Some really nice fine line detail on here, although the figures do still seem a little bit stiff, a little bit rigid, not quite naturalistic quite yet here. So we'll see in this piece a very different illustrative style. This is by an artist known as Maître Henri. He was one of the Parisian lay artists who produced books for the French monarchy. And I really just adore these figures here. They're very noteworthy for having actually some volume and three-dimensionality to them. And there's a wonderful play of light and shade. We actually get a little bit of texture and volume in these figures. We'll see David anointed by Samuel and the battle of David and Goliath. So we're seeing two different images. At the top we see David being anointed, and at the bottom we see David and Goliath. And we notice that the figures are labeled for us so that we know exactly what the scene is. We'll notice that the outfits that they're wearing are probably closer to what people would have worn in the 1290s and not necessarily biblical era dress. So we're seeing these biblical stories being put into a contemporary setting, a little bit easier for contemporary audiences to understand. Really wonderful gestural technique, and that's a lovely thing about illuminated manuscripts because of I certainly wouldn't call this a spontaneous art. A scribe and a rubricator, they don't just sit down and start drawing freehand. These have to be planned out and are very meticulously executed. However, you do start to see more of the individual hand of the artist. In particular, illuminators have a distinct style. And it's nice to see that development and a little bit more variety of style that you see in illuminated manuscripts that you're simply not going to be able to get really in the sculpture on the front of cathedrals or in mosaics or things of that nature. And here's another manuscript page, this one by Jean PUCELLE. PUCELLE's will integrate these fully modeled figures in an architectural setting rendered in fairly convincing perspective. And all of this reveals PUCELLE's study of contemporaneous painting in Italy. He was also definitely an observer of plants and animals, and we can see flora and fauna in the margins here. We'll notice how the text is laid out in two very strictly defined columns. Each section has a capital that's highly illuminated and exaggerated. You'll notice these sort of bars that come after the sentences that fill up that space. That's just there for visual effect, because we don't want that empty space there at the end of the sentences. We'll put in a little bit of decoration in there. There's so much going on at the bottom scene there. There's a wonderful little narrative playing out at the bottom. All of these little plants and butterflies and dragonflies, all of this wonderful detail in the margins. It almost makes the text hard to read. You're almost distracted from the text itself because of everything else going on. But that is a part of the idea. Not that they didn't want you to be able to read the text, but they wanted to make these books very special items. That all of the illumination, all of the color, all of that detail was a way of venerating the story and a way of showing respect and showing that this is an object worth veneration and it's a valuable object. Now in your textbook, as I'm sure you already know because you've already read the chapter, your book goes into a lot more detail in some important architectural developments in England and over in Germany and other parts of Europe. For the interest of time, and so I'm not repeating myself too often in a discussion of architectural elements, I'm not going to cover those things here. So I'm not going to go to Speyer, and I'm not going to go to Durham, and I'm not going to show you those elements here. Obviously, they're still very important, but that's what your textbook is for. So don't feel like you can skip that part of the book. I'm just doing that to keep this lecture a more manageable time so that we don't go on too long. So having said that, we're still in France here with Strasbourg, coming a little bit later on in the Gothic era, about 1230. This is the Death of the Virgin, a tympanum in the left doorway of the south transept, and it's a really fantastic thing here. So this is stylistically akin to the Visitation group of Reims Cathedral, which we saw before. The figures in this transept tympanum express a great deal of emotion and some very dramatic poses and gestures. So we're beginning to see an increased interest in humanism and human emotion here. And we haven't seen much of that throughout the Middle Ages. We've seen some abstract figures, we've seen some more naturalistic figures. We haven't seen very much in terms of real humanism and the idea of figures expressing genuine human emotion, genuine human sorrow, and we're starting to see that here. Now we're still well before the Renaissance era, so we're a few centuries ahead of the Renaissance, but I wanted to bring that up because this idea of humanism and emotion and the human experience will come back in a much stronger way in a couple of centuries in the Renaissance. But it's not to say that it's completely devoid, that there's none of that at all in the medieval era, because obviously in the Gothic we do get scenes like this that are interested in the more human elements of the drama of the story. We'll take a quick look at this sculptural pair from Naumburg, Germany. These statues approximately 6'2", and these are in the west choir, so that are inside the church. We see period costumes and very individualized features. These are donor portraits, and they give the impression of Eckhard and Uta perhaps posed for these statues, but actually Eckhard and Uta lived long before these were created, so they were deceased when these were made, but we see the Naumburg master, the creator of these, has given us a sense of the couple being there in the choir. It's a really beautiful piece. A couple of pieces, the drapery, we get much more sense of naturalism. You can see that these statues were painted. We can see many of the remnants of the paint there. Particularly in Uta, the lady on the right here, the way she holds up her cloak and the fall of the cloak, and you see her hand underneath it, drawing it across her face. There's just a wonderful subtlety of the style there. So we're getting that realism, we're getting that emotion in these pieces. If you're familiar at all, just as a side note, if you're familiar at all with classic Disney movies, things like Sleeping Beauty and some of those older movies, these figures may look kind of familiar to you. Walt Disney loved Gothic architecture and loved these kinds of images. And you can see in some of the old classic Disney references to these styles and references. Uta here, she's not directly copied in a Disney movie, but you see her sense of style and this kind of technique in some of those classic films. So our last slide for this week, we're looking at something completely different, a much smaller scale piece carved out of wood instead of stone, a freestanding statue, not a part of a door jamb or anything like that, and a highly distorted statue. I've been talking so much about this increasing naturalism, and then I show you this piece that has this, it's a Pietà, which is a scene of the Virgin Mary holding the body of Christ after he's been taken off of the cross. Allow yourself a moment to really look at this piece. There are some grotesque details here. These bodies are very distorted, as you can see. The wounds of Christ almost seem to fester. They're so dramatic and overdone. We see that real sense of grief and anguish on Mary's face. So this statuette, grieving over this sort of broken body of Christ, reflects an increased interest in the 13th and 14th century in Jesus' suffering and also in Mary's grief. So this is connected to what I was speaking of with the death of the Virgin Tympanum. An interest in the late Gothic in portraying an element of humanism in terms of the emotional content of the piece. The idea that the church and the church entities want to get worshippers to understand the suffering of Jesus and the grief of Mary in very real, very human terms. To no longer portray these characters in scenes where they seem detached or transcendent, but instead to portray them as human beings might be portrayed. So in this example, although the bodies are distorted, although the bodies are very abstract, what we connect to emotionally is how this body of Christ has been savaged, how broken he seems to be. He looks like a corpse. He looks devastated by the punishment we have received. And because of that, we feel that empathy. We feel that much more intensely than we might have in previous images of Christ on the cross or what have you. And then Mary. I mean, think about it. This is a mother holding the body of her dead child. Religious image or not, there is nothing that is more tragic than that. That is the epitome of a tragic story. And we're really encouraged in this piece, as abstract as it is, to feel that human empathy, to understand what it means to experience that grief, that loss, that shock, in a very intimate sort of way. So this is a fantastic piece, and it's really great that a piece carved out of wood has remained in such good condition for us over the centuries that we could still look at it. It's very emotional, and we see during this late Gothic period that interest in trying to connect to an audience in a more emotional way. And that will become relevant also as we move forward, as we get closer to the Renaissance, and an idea of trying to balance rational ideas and rationality with human emotion. Right here in the late Gothic, we're really trying to tap into raw human emotion and trying to figure out how to express that through the artwork. So, with that, that is going to conclude our lecture for week 13, looking at Gothic art and architecture. As I said, there was quite a bit that is mentioned in your book that I do not touch on, but make sure you're going over that and are familiar with it in the book. As always, if you have questions or concerns or anything, need me to clarify something, whatever it is, feel free to email me. My email address can be found on the Blackboard website. So once again, thank you very much for your time and attention. I appreciate it greatly, and I will talk at you next week.